What is going on?
Welcome back to the Convo Couch, everyone. Pastor Jardula here, and we have a special panel today. Of course, my co-host Fiorella Isabel is here live and in from Moscow, but we have two great guests today. We thought we would do the show because we wanted to add some clarity and kind of highlight the importance of what just happened in Colombia. Today, we have with us two people who are going to be part of the panel. Raul Barbano, who just led a delegation there, along with Terry Matson, too, as well, from Code Pink, who was actually denied entry into the country when we went to observe the election. So with this historic election that just took place, we thought it would be really important to have a panel today to kind of shed some light on the importance of what's going on and give a little nuance to to who the candidates are, who Gustavo Petro is, how he ended up here, Francia Marquez, who's now one of the first, I believe she is the first Caribbean Afro-Indigenous vice president to hold that office. And so there's a lot of kind of confusion to what's going on. So we're going to shed some light today with an amazing panel. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Raul, Terry, and of course, Fee.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right. So let's shed some light on this. I'm going to start off with the first question, let you guys dive into it and use the time and the space to really get some clarity out there. There seems to be two people right out there kind of now, two groups. I mean, there's a whole array of people, but there's a lot of leftists out there, a lot of American leftists that say, Gustavo Petro, he's not radical enough. You know what I'm saying? He's only slightly left of center. We need some real change in Latin America. And then there's also these other people in these other kind of camps who are saying, oh, Petro, he's old school ties to the Clinton Foundation. There's ties with Francia Marquez to USAID and all these situations going on. Terry, why don't you start off with telling us about who Petro is and what his presidency means to the people of Colombia?
Well, I think, thank you. First of all, I just have to say thank you for the invitation to join all of you in conversation today. It's so important for us to really look at what happened in Colombia on the 19th and also to respect what the people there have decided for themselves. So we can maybe deconstruct for a U.S. audience. And then I'm so happy that Raul Barbano has joined us today as well, because he is Colombian. And so he actually can probably, and should probably tell you a little about Petro more than I. But so let me just briefly talk about Gustavo Petro. But Raul is really the person who can give your audience some really good in-depth details about him. What we need to understand about this election is that this has been a long time coming for the Colombian people. They have lived under Uribismo, and some would even argue under Santanderismo for 200 years since the ousting of Simón Bolívar from Bogota. So the oligarchy has been in control for, some would argue, 200 years, not just the past 70. But he has run this particular election more as a centrist, more as a moderate, so as not, in my perception, so as not to be perceived as a threat, particularly because of the narrative that is often constructed in Colombia and in the United States with Venezuela being a next door neighbor. He and Francia represent hope, possibility, and change for Colombia. Their administration is going to be one out of necessity of deconstructing the system that is there today. And they will be, responsible for creating a path forward. But their administration is going to have an awful lot of deconstructing to do before it's possible to put Colombia on, a more progressive, more liberal, more leftist path. Also, and Fiorella and I have had this conversation off the air, it's really important for those of us from the United States to understand that liberalism, progressivism, leftism have different definitions in Latin America. They are a spectrum of political philosophy, center, center-left. They are not synonymous terms. And sometimes in the States, we tend to use those three terms interchangeably. In Latin America and the Caribbean, they are not synonymous terms. And so we have to look at election results, not just in Colombia this year, but also what's happened throughout the Americas last year, where people voted. There were elections, I guess I should back up. Raul and I have attended, observed many of them. Bolivia, fall of 2020, National Assembly elections in Venezuela, December of 2020. We had presidential elections in Ecuador, Chile, Peru, November of last year, Nicaragua, regional elections in Venezuela, presidential elections in Honduras. And the majority of people and their countries voted first and foremost for national sovereignty. Second, for natural resource sovereignty. And then people voted for governments that were proposing an economic plan beneficial to the majority of society. And again, that is on a spectrum from, one step left of center to revolutionary left programs. But people voted for those three things throughout the Americas. And I think Colombia is one more example. But we have to realize what the current and historical context is on the ground in Colombia. And that is what has to be respected. And that is one of the things that we can, as US, Canada, Northern Hemisphere activists, we can support, but not dictate what the Colombian people want. And so Raul can give you a much better rundown of the
Raul, you want to piggyback off that and give us a little context?
Sure. So, I had a chance I was in Colombia during the electoral process, monitoring the electoral process as the independent delegation. And I traveled through, many cities across Colombia. And, I've been to Colombia many times, and I've never felt sort of the hope that Colombians have felt, at least during the electoral process. And it doesn't mean that everybody loves all the politics of Petro, but I do think, I do see, just to put into context, Colombia has been in a crisis for a long time. And I say this all the time: political, economic, social, human rights crisis that, I guess culminated somewhat last year in a huge social explosion. Just to give you context for some of your listeners who may not know how broad and wide social, explosion was last year. Colombia has about 1,200 municipalities. Of those 1,200, in about 800 of them, there were people on the streets peacefully protesting against, government policies. We're talking about 18 million Colombians were on the street en masse at one point, again, against the government's policies. And that energy, that sort of anger, has been to some extent, I guess, canalized and brought together into an electoral platform, and it has resulted in the election of Petro and Francia Marquez. So, I think that's what it symbolizes. It symbolizes, decades and years of a very difficult situation for Colombians at all levels, except obviously for the oligarchy. And this change is monumental. And for, Colombia is the only country, and Terry sort of mentioned it already, that, 200 years of its kind of Republican history. Some people call it a genocidal democracy because people do go and vote. But, en masse, they've been killing their citizens for quite a long time. We have the positivos, where the government basically dresses people as military personnel, civilians, and then kills them and says, oh, we killed more guerrillas, right? We're talking, 8,000, 9,000 youth that have been killed in that form. So the government itself is, has committed genocide, has killed its own people with their falso positivos. And this is the situation that we've found that kind of has brought the electoral machine of Gustavo Petro, who, he is probably the most vociferous or most adequate critic of the government from within the establishment. He has been around, as people have mentioned, he's a former guerrilla fighter in the M19. He was the mayor of Bogota, and he's been quite critical of the government, of all the past different governments. And he's one of the few people who is still alive and been able to do that, or who hasn't left the country, because Colombia has some of the largest, 8 million Colombians have had to leave due to predominantly the violent or the economic situation. So it just gives you a sense of how important Francia Marquez and Gustavo are right now in the electoral process. So I think that all that energy and anger and desperation that the Colombians have been feeling for so long finally has been come together in the election of Gustavo, El Pacto Histórico.
Can I add something here real quick? I think it's important for the audience to know that Raul is Colombian and he lives in Toronto, but he is Colombian. And Raul shared something with me after the final election results came in. I was actually supposed to join his delegation on May 22nd for the first round when I was denied entry to Colombia. And I was denied entry to Colombia principally because I had been on a human rights observation delegation May of 2021 during the Paro Nacional, which Raul mentioned earlier. But Raul shared with me that, that he voted, that this is the first time he has been motivated and encouraged and hopeful to vote. And you voted at the consulate in Toronto, correct? And I think that alone, that you feeling that way, that you acting on that, is just such a strong statement in and of itself, that it's so representative of how many Colombians felt. It's not the panacea, but it's a start and it's hope.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's not unique. Many Colombians in the diaspora. I live in Toronto, as you mentioned, Terry, but many Colombians that I've met even in Colombia during my travels, because a lot of our work as electoral monitors was meeting with social movements, labor organizations, and we heard the same theme over and over. Most Colombians don't have confidence in the electoral process, but yet had hope that Petro was going to win and participated, right, for many of them for the first time. So, I mean, it is incredible from that perspective in terms of the energy, the enthusiasm, the sense of hope that people have. And I mean, I think you can hear it now when you talk to most Colombians, whether in the diaspora or in the country, in terms of things going to change. I know that there's always a lot of armchair critics, especially in the North. We sit back and, we've never achieved any kind of revolution in the North, but yet, we're very critical of processes in Latin America that aren't perfect, that don't, entail everything that we think. But I mean, whatever changes that can be made from an establishment perspective, which Gustavo has, promised to make, will make a material difference in your average Colombian, especially your average Colombian who's living in dire poverty. I think it's like 70% of Colombians live below the poverty level. They're ambulantes, which is basically people selling on the streets. These are well-educated people who, who in the streets of Bogota, Medellin, Cali, Buenaventura, whatever it may be, are selling T-shirts, sort of little trinkets and toys for anybody who's willing to buy them. So that's a desperation that Colombians feel. And I think that has changed. And you mentioned, Terry, quite clearly that it's not the panacea, but it is definitely important for Colombia itself, but also for the region. And I think it's going to give some breathing room to, progressive forces within the country and in the region.
Fam?
Bro, in terms of, and Terry, you can answer this too, in terms of this idea that Petro isn't left enough, that there could have been a candidate or somebody, or he could have advocated more revolutionary policies, and that he's spoken out against, for instance, Venezuela, has been critical, has been very positive about Joe Biden, has a picture with Bill Clinton, all of these things. In terms of that, and in terms of Francia Marquez having a sort of, not a funding, but like an influence from the USAID, do you think those conditions are important to the people of Colombia? Or do you think that in this moment, if Petro was any more antagonistic towards the West, that would have hurt him?
That's a good question. I guess a good analysis. I mean, it's called the historical pact for a reason. Colombia has been at war for 5 decades. It has been bred on like sort of anger and vengeance. So it's very hard to make any substantial change in Colombia unless, of course, the way the bureaucratic machine, the democratic system which Colombia has, which is a bourgeois democratic system which is that if you really want to take power, you have to align with center forces, and in Colombia, even right-wing forces, right, in order to be able to, a minimum, take power and to impact any change. So Gustavo now is making alliances, for example, with the Liberal Party, with all different I guess expressions. He's got the Communist Party in the Pacto. So most Colombians aren't looking for divisions. We've had decades of divisions, of war, of killing each other. That's not what Colombians are looking for. They're not looking for vengeance. They're not looking to see how is the Pacto going to come and kind of cut heads. They're looking at how are we going to bring the country together, right? There's going to have to be a national dialogue because we've been at war for. I mean, I think it's hard. It's not. We can't underestimate the difficulty that Colombia has been on for so many decades of war that we kind of needed some kind of reconciliation. And that really comes from coming together. And unfortunately, within the democratic process in Colombia, it does mean working, aligning with, kind of all sectors. But that's what Colombians want at this point. Like Colombians in Colombia, maybe not in the exterior, who are kind of analyzing in a much more comfortable situation. They do want national reconciliation. They do want to bring the country together. They want to focus on basic stuff like education, the economy, less around who is ideologically pure and whether that makes a difference to them or not. At least that's not what I heard when I was meeting with countless social movements, leaders. And in terms of Francia Marquez and the comments around funding, I mean, I think sometimes those kind of components are misconstrued. I mean, Francia Marquez is about as grassroots as it comes, and if anybody can keep the Pacto Historical more to a grassroots, it would be somebody like her, who comes from a much more kind of humble beginnings, who has been, in the fight against, mining, and has worked in the illegal mining, has comes from very difficult situations. So I think she has more of a role to play in terms of keeping it Pacto Histórico. Gustavo, as grounded as possible and bringing the influence of the Afro-Colombians and the social movements to bear and to ensure that, the Colombian economy and the Colombian kind of bureaucracy doesn't kind of seep into the Pacto Histórico and kind of make, the electoral process kind of stale, which definitely is a concern. But, the reality is Colombians need some basic things, which is alleviation of poverty, access to some education. And if the Pacto Histórico as a coalition can do some basic stuff in Colombia, it would make a huge difference for Colombians. And that's really what Colombians are looking for. They're not looking for anything else at this point. And I mean, the Pacto Histórico themselves have made it clear that this is a transitional government. They don't propose to solve, racism, the economic disparity that the country lives in within a 4-year period. So this is just the beginning. It's kind of the start of hopefully a transformation. Obviously, we're all optimistic, but like any social movements and organizations in Colombia, you have to continue to push the government to the left and make sure that it continues to follow the policy. So I think we should be hopeful and give the government a chance and work as much as we can with the government because that's really right now the best situation that Colombians find themselves in.
Well, what about this argument, the fact that, I mean, a lot of people still talk about, and you were talking specifically about the funding when it comes to Francia Marquez, right? I mean, is it in fact that, this was a NATO status country? It still is technically a NATO status country of sorts and stuff like that. But there's been a lot of NGOs that have been in Colombia for quite some time. And from what I learned when I was in Honduras is almost the same that I'm learning in Colombia, that when a person like Petro is taking over, he has to kind of somewhat walk on eggshells. I mean, I think, Terry, we were talking the other day, 700,000 votes is what separated the top two candidates at the end of the day, right? The country split. So this has to be done in a delicate manner. Isn't there something to be said, and both of you guys can jump in, to when it comes to like these NGOs that are involved in Colombia right now?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry. So
I mean, the fact is that people are saying USAID, why are they doing the business with USAID? There are all these NGOs that are already infested in Colombia, are there not? I mean, how are you going to do business in Colombia without trying to deal with these people? There's an element of them already saturated inside the country that you can't just say, oh, I'm just going to throw them out. I'm not going to deal with them. They're gone. Bye-bye. And I'm going to go on with business. And a lot of people,
I think that's correct, because we're not looking at a radical revolutionary change. We're not looking at this political party coming in and looking to, overthrow the government and completely restructure. It's not revolutionary. It's not radical. And it's like Raul said, this is a specific moment in Colombian history. It's hope, it's opportunity. This is what the Colombian people have voted for themselves, a chance to change things. And, Pasta, you just mentioned, Honduras. Well, we were all in Honduras for the presidential elections, November 27 of 2021. And we saw similar, the Hondurans have been in a narco-dictator state, nation with the largest U.S. military base in Central America on its land. You do not just change that overnight.
Thank you.
Well, you can. There are governments who have done that, but this is not what the Colombians voted for. They didn't vote for violent radical change. They have been living in violence for 52 plus years in a civil war. They're looking for some sort of, as Raul said, they have voted for some healing, to pull the country together and dismantle, some of the really negative things, and then build a path forward. And this is what they're hoping to do in Honduras too. They voted for the same sort of change for the same reasons in Honduras. And and I think Fiorella and Pasta, well, Raul as well, all of us as election observers, and particularly observing elections throughout the Americas since fall of 2020, with the return of the MAS in Bolivia, which is a perfect example of what ground movements are and what they're needed for. And we should go back to that theme regarding Colombia. But these parties, and let's talk about Honduras specifically, these coalitions that are built. And I would also argue this is what AMLO did with Partido Morena in Mexico when he became president. You build these large coalitions to heal the country, to be inclusive. And I think, that word inclusive has a whole different meaning outside of the United States than it does inside the United States. And Fiorella, you can we've talked about that. But so these parties become big movements, big coalitions to be inclusive, and also to get elected by a large percentage so that the election results are not contested domestically or internationally. We have seen in Honduras on election days, the U.S. ambassador in Tegucigalpa has come out of the embassy and declared who the president of Honduras is going to be. We did not see that in November of 2021 in Honduras, and we did not see that in Colombia.
Yeah.
So this is good, but this is incremental, and I think we have to just keep that in context. What is happening inside Colombia for its people? It is not up to those of us outside the country, particularly in the global north, to define what is needed in Colombia. We can help. We can stand in solidarity. We can go and observe the elections and help with human rights observation and all of that. But it is up for the Colombians to decide what they need and what they want.
And I think we should just, go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I don't believe the country is divided as we think it is. I know that the vote count is quite close, but Colombia is not a democracy per se, and there's a lot of fraud in the electoral process. So I'm not convinced that number that we see for Rodolfo Hernandez really represents, because when I traveled across the country, very few people outside of, there is definitely a right-wing conservative sector that would support him, but the by and large Colombians don't want that type of government anymore. That's been the kind of the historical government, Uribismo. And so, I think Colombians it's less divided than we think, but the reality is the way we just look at it is, Colombians have been under a boot for a long time on their necks. And all these elections represent is that boot now has been lifted, and there's a possibility for some change and transformation. It doesn't necessarily mean a revolution, but it definitely means that some social policies that we might look at, for example, in the North as sort of welfare policies, social policies, like they did, for example, in Brazil, Bolsa de Familia, where, single mothers with children will get a bit of money. that'll have a huge impact for women and their ability to survive, right? For campesinos to get some microcredits to continue their businesses, which is what the Pact was looking to push for. So, I mean, it is really just a breathing room for what can be. I think it's still to be determined, and the hope is that it could be much more than just sort of neoliberal change. I mean, there is a challenge where the whole establishment is still in place. So often we get confused that we take power in the electoral system and then we think, okay, we're going to win, but you have to remember that the whole machine, politically, economically, is in the hands of the right wing, of the military establishment. So that isn't going to be very easy to change. And it's going to take a while. It's going to be a process, but people are going to have to, Colombians by and large will have to come together in order to bring that change. It doesn't just come from above. I think we got to stop thinking of, the power just that comes from above. Definitely, they've been elected and they're going to make it easier, but really now it's where Colombians from the bottom are going to have to push, the revolution or the changes that are really needed from the bottom up, ensuring that the government maintains to its policies. And just in terms of, I guess, the NGO sector, I mean, that permeates through all of Latin America, unfortunately, and other countries. Yeah. And that's how kind of the U.S. has kind of used to influence social movements and sectors. The fact that, Afro-Colombians or França Marquez, particularly, I don't know that kind of, you're mentioning specifically that I guess she has, or her some people that she's worked with have received USAID. I mean, the reality of the fact is Afro-Colombians have a project for their country, and that doesn't change whether they get they got some funding from the USA. They're not trying to overthrow a government in order to bring around like Western change. They have a very clear vision of what the country should be in terms of their connection to the land, of their culture, of their way of life, and really that is what they're pushing forward, and that's what she's brought forward in the electoral platform for the historical pact.
I want to dive into the question because I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between the red tide and the pink tides that are happening in both Central and South America. So if you guys could elaborate on that, for example, I would consider Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela on the red, and perhaps Chile and Colombia, perhaps Mexico on the more pink end. If you guys could talk about that and the difference in how both contribute to moving Latin America towards a more sovereign and united front.
Go ahead, Terry, you have a lot of fun.
Well, okay, I'll share with all of you, this is just my personal observation. I spent a lot of time not at home last year between fall of 2020 and through January of 2022. I spent, I don't know, almost 40 weeks traveling the Americas with specific electoral observation responsibilities and predominantly invited by the governments themselves. So by their electoral bodies. And what I would suggest we consider, and I think looking at how things are unfolding diplomatically, not just among us activists, but what's unfolding diplomatically is you see an alignment clearly with Mexico and Argentina, Mexico being the past president of CELAC. And for those of you who don't know what CELAC is, it's regional, created by Hugo Chavez. It's all the countries in the Americas with the exception of the United States and Canada. And they had a summit here in Mexico City, September 18th of last year. It was the first summit convened in 4 years. And I give a lot of credit to the current president of Mexico for reconvening CELAC. It is worth looking at some of the YouTube videos that the whole summit, I think, was 5 hours, and that is on YouTube, the entire summit. But even if you just want to see clips that have been subtitled in English or dubbed in English, really important to understand what that body is and how it has reemerged, and that it may very well be an alternative to the OAS, or at least a body that can put pressure on the OAS to force internal change in the Organization of American States. So you see Mexico as past president, Argentina as the current president of CELAC there, but even before those two presidencies, a diplomatic and economic alignment between those two countries. I would say the new government in Chile is leaning towards that camp, and quite possibly Colombia as well, Honduras. So these are more maybe what we would call in the States social democracies. Maybe they're leaning more that way. Not real revolutionary left, as we see with Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. Bolivia kind of skirts both, I think, depending on what issue you're talking about and depending on whether it's foreign policy, domestic policy, economic, that. But so there's, again, and Fiorella, you and I have talked about, there's a spectrum. And I think that it's important to understand not all countries fall into one thing. and that's great. That is a statement.
So when you're saying red is like really revolutionary, though, I want to understand this before you. So when you say red, it's like revolutionary, like hardcore, and pink is like a stepping stone to the red. How's that? Because I think I'm misunderstanding the color coordination, Terry.
Well, I think Fiorella and I mean there's a spectrum. There isn't, because there is the term, and Raul can speak to this too, because he and I have been very involved in the first pink tide that rippled through Latin America, with the ALBA countries, Venezuela, Cuba, then Argentina, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and there were 14 of them. And that was real at the time. Again, it's a spectrum, though, at the time considered very revolutionary change. And they said pink because it wasn't like hard left. It was a spectrum. It was a mix of one step to the left of center, two hard left. So you have kind of, a neutral color, and you have red, and you throw them together, and what do you get? You get rosa, you get pink. So it's a spectrum of political and economic philosophies, and that spectrum represents each nation's sovereign decision to vote for the type of government and economy that it wants. And so there isn't any one clear definition. And I think even today, it's even less clear today. It's more of a mishmash today. Also, you have to consider the politics needed in those countries like Honduras and Colombia, who have U.S. military bases inside, Colombia being, as you mentioned, Pasta earlier, a NATO global partner. That forces a completely different, foreign policy program on these countries. Also, that, with Mexico, it has a 3,000-mile border with the United States. You don't just negate the United States in your politics, and nor can the United States negate Mexico in its foreign policy and economic decisions, your neighbors. And so, I keep using this word spectrum, and I think for me, that's the best way to understand what we're seeing. And within this spectrum of change throughout the Americas, the underlying theme is to end this heinous form of capitalism, which we all on this program know as neoliberal capitalism. In Chile, it was enshrined in the Constitution, and they're in the process of rewriting their Constitution. So,
which is a vital thing that happened, in spite of
Boric
not being everybody's favorite in terms of his criticisms of those three countries that we always talk about, but it's still a significant step forward, getting rid of the Pinochet era constitution.
The third party candidate, right? The third party candidate. Right. People don't talk about that. That can't happen in the United States. So, why are people so hard on what's going on?
Exactly.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And I think, it's kind of keeping in mind, what do, the pink tide or the red tide, whether it's closer to a more socialist communism versus more of a social democratic, what do those countries have in common? I kind of look at more what are the commonalities, right? So, in general, their commonality is respect for sovereignty, right? Regional integration and being able to utilize your natural resources to benefit yourselves, however you do that, whether it's through a capitalist model. Lula did that through more capitalism, bourgeois capitalism in Brazil, Chavez and Maduro, had tried to do it more through kind of socialist, nationalist state intervention. But today, for example, under the blockade that Venezuela lives under, they've had to move to more of a capitalist model, right, in order to protect investment, and in order to attract investment, for example. So it really depends. But I think, if we look at the commonality of that, and it's really about, a multipolar world, right? So moving away that the U.S., that we in Latin America are the backyard, the front yard, whatever you want to call it, of the U.S., and they kind of dictate exactly what happens in the Americas. And that's where really that, the pink, the red, the left eye, that's really kind of the expression of what's happening in Latin America in general. And we kind of see that movement again. It started quite strongly in 2000s under Chavez and the Bolivarianism, like the Bolivarian experiment and Alba and all that. And it seems to, it kind of petered off a little bit. And then we saw another wave of kind of neoliberalism. But again, as neoliberalism entrenches itself and destroys Latin America economically, politically, and socially, the more that people start to reawaken and say, you know what, we need to change things. And I think that's what we're seeing is more that commonality. And, Petro, who he said it pretty clearly, he's going to develop Colombia in a capitalist model, in a very capitalist way. I mean, he's talking about closer regional integration, about building links with Venezuela, even though ideologically he doesn't see eye to Maduro, but he realizes that it's a key neighbor, and there's no need to be have animosity towards Venezuela.
Yeah, I think what you just said right there is a lot of people questioning that exactly what you talked about, the capitalist statement in the chat. Fam, did you have another question before I jump into the next one, or?
No, go ahead.
Well, I want to talk about the nationalization of oil, right? Because we talked about one of the three reasons Terry mentioned about why these people voted for the change they wanted to. And national sovereignty was number one. Number two was natural resources. There's been a lot of pushback against Petro about his kind of like green mental ideology, which is something that's really sad. It gets kind of lost in the fray. In the United States, I think there's this whole kind of thought process where a lot of neoliberals want to use the ideology of a Green New Deal of some sorts to grab more and commodify more of natural resources and whatnot, and usher in another form of control and whatnot. So when they see Petro saying, "Well, we want to keep the oil in the ground," they think number one, he's kind of turning his back on China, and that's kind of like, oh, he's doing the bidding of the United States. And number two, the fact that he won't nationalize his own oil means that he's also a puppet of the West of some sorts. That's some of the criticism against him. Do you guys want to talk a little bit more about that, about the fact that can he even nationalize his own oil if he wanted to? Because we saw in Honduras, that was something that they said they weren't going to do right away. They said they were going to open up to more competition. So do you guys want to give a little more, provide a little bit more context to the whole resource issue when it comes to a Green New Deal, and the fact that could a person like Petro, if he wanted to, nationalize the oil without getting cooed?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the conditions in Colombia wouldn't allow for any type of nationalization. And I mean, Petro has to be very careful. You have to remember, as I mentioned before, Colombians have been fed for decades of fear of communism, fear that, Colombia is going to become Castro Chavismo type of state. Petro, anything radical probably would have had him lose the elections, to be honest with you. So definitely he's kind of contained politically from that perspective. And I'm not sure that at this moment in time that Colombia, he could nationalize it. And he said he wouldn't, and he's been very clear that he won't nationalize anything. But that's not really, that's not what Colombians are asking for. Maybe there's some leftist radicals for sure that would want that. And I'm not saying that's not a bad thing, but currently that's not what's going to change the dynamic. So for example, in terms of, I do think that Petro, and this comes, I think, a lot more from Francia Marquez and the Afro-Colombian sort of environmental movement, which is, the extractive industries, which is specifically, the mining and the other extractive, is having a huge impact disproportionately on indigenous and Afro communities in Colombia. So that's the first thing that, kind of needs to come to an end. It has to stop, right? Eventually, not, obviously not right away. And I think that is a huge push of social movement. So when people say that's like an environmental kind of Western thing, it's odd, because that's what the communities who are most impacted in Colombia, who live near El Páramo, for example, who want to protect the rivers and as everybody calls it, the pulmones of the world, which is the Amazon, right, which is the lungs of the world. So I think to suggest that to want to protect the it's almost like saying climate change doesn't exist and we don't need to do anything. We just can continue in kind of our merry way of consuming our way out of a crisis. So there is an environmental crisis that we have to be conscious of, and it's done due to the extractive industry and human consumption. So that needs to change, and I think that's an important component that nobody can deny. And how that's done, that's always going to be a challenge, because yes, if you change your economy, how are you going to create green jobs for workers in the oil industry, which is a big thing that he's had to talk about, which is the same thing in Canada we talk about. Like, if we're going to move off, the oil sector in Canada, we need to find jobs for people in the oil sector, because that's what people want. Like, people aren't just going to go, okay, we're going to save the environment, we're not going to be unemployed. And that's not the reality. That's not how it works. So I do think that is an important component of the social movements in Colombia, especially the ones that are most impacted by, the climate change, which is Afro-Colombians and indigenous communities who are saying, look, we have to put an end to this. And so he's starting with that. He's just starting with a moratorium on more exploration, right? Like, he's not stopping it. He's not saying that he's gonna, renege on anything that they've already given. So he's only putting a moratorium on any new exploration, which is, again, just from a start perspective, which is not that different than, Hugo Chavez and other leaders who who have an oil base. They talked also about moving off, the oil sector, but again, they couldn't. They weren't able to. The dependency, the fight against the U.S. Made it very difficult. But that is really the goal of any progressive government, is to protect the environment and to ensure that we move off like a dirty economy. And the extractive industry is that. It's the heart of capitalism, and it's the heart of the dirty economy globally.
Can I just add with what Raul mentioned with indigenous and Afro-Caribbean communities in Colombia being most affected by the devastating effects of extractionism. This is also at this moment what the indigenous people in Ecuador are protesting against, just to bring it to a right now, today issue. And it's this has happened throughout the Americas, and it's been led by Afro-Caribbean people and the indigenous people of the Americas. I also feel, on a very personal level, looking at Petro's decision to re-engage and recognize the Maduro government and open the Venezuela-Colombia border, I think this is huge. And the reason I think it's huge is because Colombia is a NATO global partner. NATO, Venezuela is a strong ally of Russia. So we're potentially looking at a NATO-Russia clash in South America, not unlike what's happening in Eastern Europe now. And I think that this is one of the things that we're not celebrating Petro enough for, is that I believe has been diffused in the Americas with this recognition of Maduro and opening the border and looking to reestablish economic. Yes, they are different politically, but this is happening throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, where some of the political differences are being put aside for the betterment of economic growth, for economies that will benefit all of the people. And again, it's a spectrum of economic philosophy, but I think this is really huge what has happened between Colombia and Venezuela, much more than just migration.
I want to make a really quick point here while you guys are on this before Fee grabs the next question, and is that there's been this argument when people come out and they say, well, Gustavo Petro was really harsh and badmouthed Maduro the whole time that he was running for office and for these last several years. But then we also go to Colombia and we see, when we talked to Magistrate Luis Perez, and he talked about, oh my God, there was a point where they were trying to frame Gustavo Petro getting funded by the Maduro government, and they try to throw that into the mix right now. And I tell people it's just politics when you hear that stuff, because at the end of the day, when Gustavo Petro won the presidency, Maduro picked up the phone and he called them, and they started building relations almost immediately. So I tell a lot of people in the States, like, don't pay attention to the scuttlebutt or the noise that Petro hates Maduro, because it's not true. And at the end of the day, I think the most important thing that Gustavo Petro brings to the table is the regency, the regional unity that they're already opening up right away when it comes to the Venezuelan Colombian border. Sorry to interrupt, fam. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to comment to everything that was said. The United States left, or what they call themselves as left in the global north, particularly the United States, has a tendency to just bash everything pro-environmental now because of what Pasta said into a negative specter. But I think the environmentalism that comes from Latin America is a very economic base, meaning the extraction of resources by nations in the global north and in the west, and the profiting of these nations and these multinational corporations. It happens with the mining in Bolivia, it's happened in Peru, it's obviously happened in Colombia as well. And it's that extraction of wealth in a resource-rich nation that never gets to see that wealth that has been a prime reason and a prime underlying push for why these Latin American countries too, particularly the indigenous populations and the Afro populations, have been fighting against. Because it's not just, oh, we care about the environment. This is our bread and butter. This is our country that the wealth is being extracted from. And I think there's a tendency to overlook that in terms of what that means. It's not just people being environmental activists. It's people that are fighting back against the exploitation of these countries by the West for the longest time. And you're absolutely right. It is a huge deal that Venezuela, a nation that has, right now, people here in Moscow working on with the oil industry in Venezuela, being diplomats and having this relationship, very close relationship with Russia. Russia is very well aware of this election. They covered this election. I was on RT to talk about this election because they're like, wow, this is significant. This means that the Colombian people are fostering a relationship with Venezuela, and that's putting them in opposition to NATO, and also in perhaps opening relationships to Russia and China. It has a huge geopolitical implications on a global scale, especially right now with the conflict we're seeing with Ukraine and Russia, and of course NATO and the United States. And so I think that cannot be overlooked, and the fact that it's just being minimized based on some sound bites of, Petro saying negative things about Maduro, and Maduro saying, things about the cowardly, less, revolutionary types. I think that as Pasta said, is a lot of just noise. I think what we need to look at are the actions that are happening. And I do want to ask you all on that note, what the tendency in the United States by a lot of media, including independent media, is to compare the global north politics in the same paradigm as it is in Latin America. The left means something entirely different in the global north as it does in the global south, particularly Latin America we're talking about here. The right means something different. Mm-hmm. When we talk about the right in South America and Central America, we often talk about paramilitary narco governments that are killing people. When we talk about the right in North America, we're talking mostly about a Trump supporter that, that is very, could be racist, could be talking about something, whatever, but we're talking about two different things here. And so I wanted to kind of dive into the difference between these terminologies and how perhaps the quote unquote left in the United States has a tendency to just compare everything within their paradigm.
Well, that's a form of imperialism, isn't it? And interventionism. And I think that's something that, we have to get better at. Those of us that, are based in the, born and raised in the United States, we have a lot of undoing of ourselves first. And as Raul said, it's easy to be on the outside and criticize what's not happening. What's not happening in Colombia. It's not revolutionary. It's not leftist enough. We haven't had any sort of revolution in the United States since the Revolutionary War. So, what example do we have to speak truth from and to lead from? We should be learning from these people south of the border. We have a lot to learn from them before we start, commenting on, on what did or didn't happen to our liking. I would say, for me, on a really, really personal level, this is how I met Raul. I cannot emphasize enough to people in the United States, working people, professional people, activists, students, journalists, how important it is to pick up a delegation and go study a country from inside, on the ground, and be exposed to the politics and the economics and the different movements that are happening. You will be forever changed. I don't care if you move an inch or a mile. I cannot emphasize enough how important that experience will be for you. It's just it's paramount to experience something from the ground. And Raul is a expert at leading trips. And there's going to be a few back to Colombia. I think a couple of organizations going to Colombia in August. And I just can't
Venezuela over there with you. We want to get to Venezuela and check it out. I just want to say
that's how Raul and I met.
Listen, Terry, that's so important. And I just want to piggyback really quick, and I'll hand it right back off that, I'm a guy who just went to 5 countries now in the global South. And wow, my mind is blown. And when we get out there, we don't just talk to the people who come to visit us in delegations. We talk to the cab drivers, the waiters, the bartenders. Everywhere we go, we talk to the people, and it just changes your whole perspective of what you get in the West, and what you're told Venezuela is like, as opposed to when you go there, what you're told Nicaragua's like, as opposed to when you go there. So I just really want to piggyback and say, absolutely, Terry. And we tell these people, talk to people who've gone there, who've been inside the country.
Go yourself.
And go yourself.
Go yourself. Yeah. Can we just go back to this campaign issue regarding Petro, Maduro, Colombia, Venezuela? There's something that we in the activist world have to really understand, is that, there's the diplomatic world that we don't always agree with, but those big picture hemispheric things happening on the diplomatic level, government to government, economic to economic. And then, we journalists and activists are kind of under, that big picture. And then there are also things that are said within the context of a campaign, a presidential campaign, a mayoral campaign, gubernatorial campaign. There are things that are said within a campaign that, perhaps are backtracked with a personal phone call, at the end of the day saying, hey, we said this about Venezuela, but, if we're elected, this is our real intent, or whatever country you're talking about. So there's this huge diplomatic nation to nation umbrella that, we have to consider, that we're, underneath all of that. We're inside all of that. We're not dictating it. You have to just keep that in mind, when you're looking at and listening to what people are saying and doing. Can we go back to the social movement theme that Raul brought up? Because I think this is so, and he's one of the best people, to work with regarding social movements, labor specifically, but how important the movements were in getting the Pacto Histórico elected, and following, on the footsteps of what we saw in Bolivia, fall of 2020, what happened with the MAS, how important this is. And I think this is really something, those of us in the global north, specifically the United States, something we can really learn from. And I know we've tried to do it in our history, and it gets, co-opted by the government and often destroyed by the United States government. But how important this is to have a political party come out of a movement. And that movement has to be a wide variety of social, economic, labor, I mean, everything, students, all of that. The party it really is phenomenal and most successful when the party comes out of that movement, because you're not, each party is not always going to have the power of the government. But if you hold together as a coalition and a big movement, your party will always have power on the ground, and you can keep your party platform, your goals, your ideals there among the people. And then, you come back into power and you're all set to go again. I cannot emphasize how important that is. And those of us, who travel Latin America and watch elections and work with social movements, that is really so key. It worked in Bolivia, it worked in Honduras. I think we could argue it somewhat worked in Peru. It most definitely has worked in Colombia, and we may very well see it coming to fruition again in Ecuador in this moment. But we're not real good at understanding that in the United States, and I think we stay a little, maybe too much in our own identity and political silos in the U.S. Instead of working at what the fundamental social issues of the day are that affect all of us. Those principal 2-3 things that we all, need to unite around and work for and build a coalition of change around. In Latin America, a lot of what we consider activist issues at home in the global north in the U.S. are really, quite frankly, luxuries, if they're even on the radar, at all.
When you say luxuries, you're talking about wokeness?
Well, I mean, yeah.
You do have a great comment about what wokeness is, and I think it really does play into what the struggle is really going on, and puts into perspective of the luxury we get about the term wokeness. So I think we have to be careful. In the global north, we had, I think we're losing it, access to, as we go to this more harsh neoliberal model, privatization of everything. For people who don't understand the term neoliberal, privatization, full 100% privatization of an economy, no public institutions or infrastructure. Women particularly, and I do realize I'm speaking as a white English-speaking woman from the United States, but access to education, decent infrastructure, electricity and running water in our homes, those things are still do not exist for the majority of people in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so, you talk to somebody who defines herself as a feminist, say in Nicaragua, is she necessarily pro-abortion? In many cases, it's not even on the radar. She will define feminism as, I want electricity and running water in my house. I want, a primary school down the street for my kids. I want a health clinic around the corner for my aging parents. I want roads, like basic things. Yeah.
Right. So, we have to keep, again, this comes back to respecting the national sovereignty of a people and what they want for themselves and how they define what they want for themselves. Yeah. And it's not the same, country to country, and everybody is on a different, a different scale of development and access to basic human rights. I would say, we're losing human rights in the States. The Cubans most certainly would say the access to healthcare and housing is a human right, which we don't have in the U.S. So,
yeah. Isn't that important too as well?
To just keep that context,
Terry, isn't it important also too as well what you just said? I just want to piggyback off that too. And Raul, I want your opinion as well, that each country has its own specific needs, that it's not really good to just lump all these countries together in Latin America and say they're all the number one issue for all these countries, no matter whether it be Colombia, Nicaragua, whatever, is human rights. Isn't it just specific to the actual country and what their needs and wants are?
I would also say Africa as well. That what you just said needs to be applied to Africa as well. Yeah, respecting the individual national sovereignty.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we wouldn't generalize and assume that what's happening in the U.S. is the same as happening in Canada, right? So we'd have different contexts. I think what's important for Colombia specifically is what's going to happen next. So what are kind of the next steps that the Pacto Histórico, Petro and Francia undertake? And the sense that I'm getting is that they're moving forward to a national dialogue, right? Which is, and that includes, and this is not always, not everybody's going to like this. It includes conservative, maybe even right-wing sectors in the country around how do we come together to make the situation, to end the violence, for example, as a start. Let's just start with ending the violence. Let's agree to the peace agreement. Some basic things that could would bring Colombia forward quite a lot. So that is kind of the tradition of where Petro comes from, which is sort of the M19 sort of national dialogue that by community you can win popular power. And so that's what I expect that will happen in Colombia, which is the sort of national dialogue and getting people together. And it may not be everybody that everybody wants to see there, but from a Colombian context, this is the way it's going to be, which it'll include all sectors, left, conservative, communist, right wing, probably some Uribistas as well, because he's even reached out to Uribe, right? This is where it's really going to see what is Colombia going to transform into. Is it going to descend into more the sectorial, to be much more sectorial type of thing? But I do see a national kind of, I mean, these words always sound kind of odd in the North America, like reconciliation, where people need to come together and say, first, look, we got to stop killing each other. That's a start. We have to dismantle the paramilitary structures that still exist, right? Like, let's start with that. And if we can undertake that, then that's a huge step forward for your average Colombians.
So my question is like along the lines of how these social movements were able to in Colombia come together and eventually reach enough power to unite and have this pacto histórico. Because, for example, in the United States, there is nothing remotely close to that, because a lot of the times what happens is people are fighting and they're saying, no, we don't want to align ourselves with you. You just mentioned that the Pacto Histórico and this alliance of people is so effective because it encompasses so many, again, a spectrum of different political parties, of different political ideologies. And so my question is, how did that happen? And is that possible, as all of us have lived or live in the global north? In the global north, and specifically in the United States, where you just see so much division and so much just reluctance in working with people who disagree with them.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start with that. Sorry, Terry, unless you want to go.
No.
So I think the conditions where Colombians find themselves, we talked about, after the pandemic, the economic crisis that Colombia is in, the human rights crisis. Those conditions for all sectors of Colombia have been really hard hit. Indigenous, campesino, labor, students, youth. There really has been no hope for the youth in Colombia. For people in all sectors, is really, it's been like no hope whatsoever. So I think the conditions have said, if we could come together and take power and implement some basic changes, that in itself, is people are willing to put aside their differences to some extent, right? I do think that is, that's a plus, and there's also a challenge, because then that's really going to be like, do you dilute your politics? Are you going to, not implement something because you might not be able to? So I mean, that definitely it's a plus. It's great. It sounds wonderful. We're bringing everybody together under the same big tent. But then in the end is what you implement. How diluted is that going to be? How effective is it going to be? Is it going to be transformational? Is it going to be just touching the surface? Are you going to touch the structural issues? Right. So I do think, we have to wait to see. I know we could make some, I try to avoid making so many kind of predictions of what it might be. My hope is always that it's going to be something positive. But I do think that the conditions were so difficult for every sector in Colombian history that really it was almost like desperation brought people together and said, look, we need to do something different. We can't have another 4 years of another right wing, the boots on our neck. And so that's what forced people to come together, not always, because by want, but it's really by need. And that's a situation that Colombians find themselves. But I do think that there's a genuine sense, and Petro has that kind of ability to bring people together and try to build sort of that big tent. And so he has done a good job. I mean, the man is incredibly smart. He is, I would say, a genius. He's, in terms of, there's not been too many politicians who are as smart and as well spoken and as articulate and has such a clear vision as Petro and the Pacto Histórico. So, I mean, there are, individuals that are kind of unique in time. We've seen them, Castro, Chavez, that have that ability to bring such diverse sectors together. And I don't think we can negate the fact that Petro has that ability. I mean, he has other challenges as well, but I do think that the conditions in Colombia brought people together because there's nothing, there's no hope. So it's either this or we die kind of thing. So I think this is where, but it's kind of the conditions that brought people together.
Terry, do you want to leave like with what Raul just said, right? That's what they needed. That's more than, it was out of necessity why this big tent has come together. How should we as Americans look at this and support this election? I mean, I mean, is it okay for us to cast aspersions and kind of, look at the doubts and kind of raise questions and say, oh, there's a classic picture of Petro with Bill Clinton. We need to keep an eye on him or whatnot. How should we look at this election? How should we speak of this election as Americans?
Can I first say that we're citizens of the United States and that the entire hemisphere is America. Colombians are Americans as well. Yes. Colombians are South Americans.
As the global,
we're North Americans along with Raul in Canada.
Yeah. Please.
So we're U.S. citizens, and as U.S. citizens,
thank you.
We're all Americans, North, Central, and South. As U.S. citizens, we have to respect what the Colombian people have decided for themselves. Our role, the one role that we definitively have assigned to us, is to influence our own government, its policies, economic, military, foreign policy, all of it, education, all of it. And now I will say through today, women's rights as well. Our responsibility is to influence change in our own country. And that change, particularly with economic, military, and foreign policy, we change the United States, those changes will ripple out across the hemisphere. The number one thing you consistently hear, if you choose to go on a delegation to somewhere in in Latin America, the Caribbean, I guarantee you, somewhere along that trip itinerary, you're going to be in a meeting, in a cab, in a restaurant, somewhere, and someone is going to say to you, go home and fix your own country first. The rest of us will benefit. And that is very, very true. That is the one responsibility we have, is to the rest of the hemisphere, is to influence change at home.
Fam, anything else?
I mean, I would just add, I think it's, sorry, go ahead. My apologies.
No, I was saying, go ahead. Yeah.
So I think what it is it's linking our struggles. Sometimes we think that, people in Latin America are struggling for this, that. I mean, we have to remember is that the struggles of Latin America are very similar to the struggles we have in the North, right? We're struggling against privatization. We're struggling against deregulation, criminalization of our citizens, militarization, war. So I think when we start to link our struggles with the struggles in the global South is when we realize that, wait, they're not just struggling for themselves. When we're all fighting for the environment, it's not just Colombians who are fighting for the environment. It's not just, indigenous and Afro-Colombians, it's all of us. So I think the first thing we got to do is we have to link our struggles together. So we have to, like, as Terry mentioned, have our struggles in the North to change the policies of our governments, who in many cases, the Canadian government and the US governments are the ones that are supporting, dictatorships in the global South, supporting countries that violate human rights, that destroy the environment. I think the first step we can do, as Terry mentioned, is, really undertake our struggles in the North, but then link those struggles, because we're not just being in solidarity with people in the South. We're not just feeling bad for people in the global South because they're in bad situations. We want to struggle with them and be in the same struggles, because we will all benefit in the end. And I think that's where, linking our struggles is key for that.
Yeah.
Anything else, fam?
No, I mean, I just don't think the conditions in the United States are there for any sort of revolution. And I think when you mentioned conditions, both of you, the conditions were there in Colombia, the conditions for a change, right? For a change. The conditions have been there in other parts of Latin America out of need. When the empire, the United States and the West have been imposing their boot on the rest of the world, particularly South and Central America, as well as Africa, and obviously West Asia, these people have no choice but to fight back because their lives, their economics are all impacted. What we're seeing right now in the United States with the Roe v. Wade situation that has been weaponized by both parties for fundraising and for, just manipulation of a political ideology. That's the symbolism of where we're at in the United States. We're going to have people marching in the streets for abortion. As a woman, I mean, I'm pro-choice, but that's irrelevant because at the end of the day, while that's happening, we're facing a 40-year record high inflation, ridiculously high gas prices, and there are millions more being given to Ukraine. So to me, it's the United States' inability to focus on economic need because they haven't had to. And I think we're nearing that point where we're going to have to, and only then will perhaps there be material conditions for the people to change because they haven't felt that much of the imperialism that other countries have felt. So I appreciate the discussion. I don't know if any of you want to talk about anything else. I'm open to hearing it, but it was really educational, I think, for a lot of people. So thank you for coming on and having it.
Yes, Raul, Terry, thank you guys so much for joining us. I think you guys provided a lot of nuance today, and a lot of people can learn from this particular show today. I know I have learned even more, and I've been, had the chance to go to Colombia and pay attention to what's going on. So thank you guys so much for coming on today. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to talk with all of you.
Thank you for the space and for the time.
Let us know where we can find your work, both Terry and Raul.
So I'm with an organization called Common Frontiers. You can find us on the web, www.commonfrontiers.ca, and it's linked with the labor movement in Canada. And we do work around human rights and democracy, and we'll most likely be in Brazil as well around the upcoming elections in Brazil.
Nice.
And I'm one of the Latin America campaign coordinators for Code Pink, codepink.org. I'm also the weekly host of our YouTube program, What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean. We broadcast on YouTube, Code Pink YouTube Live every Wednesday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Also, I'm happy to share with all of you, I am a new board member with the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, COHA, COHA.org. So you can follow my work with them as well.
Yeah,
congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I guess I think
we learned today what the F was going on in Colombia, and we do appreciate that. So, guys, if you haven't joined up for our Rokfin, please go to the Rokfin/the CONVO Couch. Join over there too as well. We have a YouTube, we have a Twitter. Thank you so much for joining us today. For Raul, Terry, I am Pasta Jardula.
I'm Fiorella.
And we got Oz on those 1s and 2s spinning, guys. Thank you so much.
See you Monday.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.